I just want to describe now the development of a particular learning tool, an activity essentially, which I use in trading. Looking back at my notes, this is something that goes back to as early as 2005. It's a tool, an activity designed to explore prejudice. In fact, to enable learners to recognise that prejudice exists in all of us, and then exploring how we relate to that understanding. So I took a biography, or maybe an autobiography, of one of the first Africans who experienced life in the West. It's the life of Olaudah Equiano, who lived at the end of the 18th century and experienced periods of slavery, having been taken from West Africa to the Caribbean and to Europe, exploring his attitude to the societies to which he was exposed. And what I did essentially was to take extracts from the book and either remove those key words which would, as it were, betray the profile of the writer, so that I ended with a series of, I think, 8 statements, and I invite learners, I read each statement in turn, one at a time, and invite learners to gradually build up a profile of who this individual might be. I explain to them it's not very likely that they will know the specific identity of the writer, but that they should try to gradually elaborate a profile of the writer, who he or she may be, the period when they may have been around, the context in which they find themselves, etc. The statements, for most people, and I ask learners at the end of each sentence, after I've read each sentence and displayed each sentence on a sheet with any, let's say, any out of date wording, explained with more modern terminology, because the text is a kind of 19th century text, really. Anyhow, so they hear each of these statements and read them, and then I suggest they just bullet point some ideas around each statement. So after each statement they develop this profile. At the end of the statements, I invite learners to offer their view, their profile of this individual. Almost inevitably, it's a European explorer, missionary, settler who is identified. It's that kind of profile which is identified. I give people an opportunity to share those things, explain why they've reached those conclusions, and then I reveal the identity of Equiano, at which most people are surprised. And then we explore how learners have arrived at that conclusion, and we look at all the formative influences on them throughout their lives, especially in childhood and teenage years, in all those formative years, and how the sheer weight of information which they receive leads to the conclusion that it was only Europeans, white Europeans, who went out and experienced these for them, abnormal, unusual, different, uncivilized ways of behaving in other parts of the world. That's what is recorded, the sheer bias of history, and how that feeds prejudice. We look further at how there's an affective, an emotional component, a profound component to prejudice. It's not simply facts, it's the emotional package that contains those facts. So if it's come from your father, if you are now looking at how your father, let's say, either didn't understand, was ignorant, or misrepresented reality, it's very hard then to unpackage those things because of the emotional attachment. Anyhow, so it's a way of showing everybody that we all share prejudice, that prejudice, nobody is immune from prejudice, and it's the understanding of that, the knowledge of that, that then enables us to address it, and how we can apply that to our work with young people. And that's a tool that I designed. I included it in a handbook, a booklet that I edited and co-authored with 3 colleagues from other European countries on inclusion and diversity, and I've provided a link to that. So the tool was described in that booklet, and I've used it ever since. And in fact, one of the lesson plans I'll use when I talk about devising lesson plans, one of the lesson plans I'll use, which I only used a couple of months ago, includes the Echiano activity, profile of E, as I call it, before I reveal the identity of the individual. So that's one example of a tool that I've developed myself.